Um, we want to. I want to break down some of the missions things that we're talking about and teaching on a different level here, and that level is a level that is kind of the behind the scenes. You want to peek behind the scenes because it's easy in a missionary ministry and in missionary conferences to kind of hear about missions in a protective sense, to where everything is motivational speaking, right? Like, this is the best thing that's ever going to happen to you. Just sell your house, live in a car, go around and ask people for money, and it's just going to be so much fun. So we are now 25 years into this, and I would say this: no regrets. No regrets, but some hard lessons learned. So we want to go tonight, and I'm not even going to get deep in the scriptures. I brought my Bible up because I know I'm going to be tempted to run back into it, but I think we know what the Bible says, to go preach the gospel to every creature. I think we know that. I think we know how the local church fits in that. Brother David did a good job on that. So the question then is, all right, so from the standpoint of, I guess, the personnel, the human cost of this, like an HR session right here now. Okay, so what's this look like for your family? What do you do when you're in these situations? And so I've kind of labeled this based off of a message Cathy and I heard when we came home from Africa. We went to Africa in the year 2000. By the year 2001, we were already home. Now, for us, that was devastating because we thought we're the first missionaries ever failed. Like, we didn't know that it was fairly common for that to happen. And it kind of set us back looking and examining, okay, did we not know God? Did we not hear God? What did we do wrong? Were we not spiritual? What happened? And so we're kind of working through that process. And we sat down at church service one day, and as a Sunday school lesson, and a missionary got up, and he said, let me give you 10 reasons why missionaries fail. He'd been about 30 years in the mission field. And when he said that, I thought, here we go again. We're going to get beat up again. Because I was already beating myself up, and we're looking at pastors with this defensive idea of like, okay, we stole their money and ran with it. That's how you feel when you come home. And so the idea we had is, here we go again. But that is not at all what he did. What he did is he gave us some understanding of the trials we went through, and he kind of opened our eyes to where we didn't even know that was happening until he told us what was happening. So you're in the emotional state of missions. You're in that state where it's, I've made this promise, I'm just going to trek through it. And you don't usually stop to reevaluate and say, what is actually happening to my family? What am I going through? And it was, ironically, it was a 5-year process for us. So it took us 4 times longer to recover from going to the mission field than it did to serve on the mission field. And that's very, very common. So the numbers are staggering. How many families go and come home is staggering. How many families come home and do not go back into any service, any kind of ministry, is staggering because they tried, they failed. So Brother Gil Anger gave that lecture, that Sunday school lesson that morning, 10 reasons why missionaries fail. But I want to examine this a little bit deeper. I want to say this. It's not necessarily why they fail, because that word fail has such a negative context, all right? So I would say 10 reasons why missionaries fail, or 10 reasons why missionaries come home, or 10 reasons why missionaries quit. Not all of it's bad. So I'm going to read through the list here, and that's all we're going to do tonight. Just read my list. 10 reasons why missionaries fail, but there's actually 16. I tried to get to 10, and I just couldn't do it. And a lot of them actually have 2. Like, there's a sub point. But Cathy's here because Cathy has a better understanding of what was going on emotionally for us during that time. So when you're a man and you're busy at work, you're focused on work. And some of the stuff we talk about now, I'll talk about it from just a purely analytical perspective. But I don't have any feel of it anymore. It was just something that we did, and it's gone. But she still has more of that feel and emotion to some of it. So I want to make sure that she's included. The first thing I want to say this is the first reason why missionaries come home is because it's the will of God. Yeah, I got one amen. I'm going to say again. Yeah, there we go. We're picking up steam. The first reason why missionaries come home is because it's the will of God. God did that. So not every time you see a missionary come home do you think there's the loser that we gave money to and he quit. You have to reconcile the fact that God uses men and women in very unique ways. And if God wants to send me to the backside of the desert so I can learn some things about God and bring me back home, God has the right to do that. And so every time we see this, I counsel missionaries constantly on this, and they say, man, I don't want to quit. I say, but what did God tell you to do? Say, could God tell me to quit? God can tell you to move. God can tell you to start over. God can tell you to move into a different ministry. God can tell you to move to a different church. God can change your direction. And so we have the idea that every missionary who went and came home quit. And that, first of all, that's a lie. That's a fabrication. Every time Paul went out, he came back. That's just the way that it worked. And then he looked at the map, he prayed, the Lord led him, and he went back out, sometimes the same direction, sometimes a different direction. And so when we came home, I knew in my heart I couldn't go back. I knew it. I knew my wife couldn't do it. We came home primarily due to malaria. And I knew to go back was to sacrifice my family. And I was struggling with that. Because isn't Christ worth my family? He is. But how do you reconcile that with he that provideth not for his own, especially they of his own house, is worse than an infidel and has denied the faith? So I'm teetering. I'm looking at her saying, we got to go back. We made a promise. God told us to go. And I'm looking at my kids, and I'm thinking, this could be the last decision I ever really make for them. How do I reconcile that? And so I was at a prayer meeting one night on about a midnight on a Saturday night, and there's an older pastor there, and I'm bearing my heart to him. I'm saying, God told me to go. I want to go. I made a promise to go, but I'm looking at my family and my children were on pace to not survive. That's how sick we were. But I was ready to sacrifice them mostly because of the promise that I made, which was pride. And this older pastor looked at me and he said, well, Brother Matt, he said, it's really easy. God told Abraham to go to Mount Moriah and sacrifice Isaac. That's the will of God. That's the word of God. Abraham goes. He gets the firewood. He gets everything. He goes. He leaves his servants. He takes the wood. He takes the knife. He takes the fire. He goes to the top of the mountain. And by all rights, what should he do? He's going to sacrifice that son. But when he raises the knife, what happens? God speaks. And that man said to me that night, he said, I know what God told you to do 2 years ago. He says, what's God telling you to do tonight? And I said, God's telling me to stay home. I'm telling you, it costs more to stay home than it costs to go. It costs more to stay home than it was to go, because now I have to write a letter and go tell everybody, mark me up as another failed missionary. I tried, I failed, I spent your money, I didn't do what I promised to do. But I came home that night at midnight that night, and I told my wife, I said, God told us to stay home. And would you just give a little testimony on what God was doing in your heart?
Really the same thing there, I would say. I remember when he came home and said that we were staying, there was relief quickly, and then, oh no, very quickly after that, because of the same thing. You know, people are gonna, and of course, as women, or as wives, we care what people think about our husbands, right? So I didn't want anyone to think badly or poorly of Matt because of the decision to stay home, yet knowing it was the right one.
So the hardest decision I ever made was to stay home from Africa. So this is not even a list. This is pre-list. All right. Don't look at every time a missionary leaves the field and say they're a loser. God moves people. It took us from 2002 to 2006, 4 years before God ever told us why we came home. It took 4 years. For 4 years, we're going to church, and somebody said, weren't you guys missionaries? And I was like, yes, but we're failed. You know, that mentality. In 2006, God brought peace in our lives and showed us why we went to Africa. And it takes time, and those are desert years. Those are dark years for missionaries, and a lot of our missionaries don't come out of that. They'll get out of church. They'll have trouble in their families because they can't understand how God could change their direction. So here's what we've done. Instead of finding our identity in Christ, we found our identity in ministry. That became our sole purpose. But really, Christ is my life. Colossians chapter number 3. So, all right, let's get started now. Number one, and these are in no specific order, but number one, reasons why missionaries come off the field, quit, fail, is because some of them are unsaved. I know that's not going to get a lot of amen. But we've come up through a system where that our religion was based upon our works, be that a prayer or our commitment or our abilities. We based our relationship with God on what we did, not just our salvation, but our sanctification. And so you're going to deal with missionaries who have come off the field or are struggling on the mission field, and it sounds silly, but one of the first things we're going to say is, tell us about when you came to Christ. What happened? What's your faith in Christ like? Give us a testimony. And you were going to meet people who have spent their whole lives trying to satisfy God by their labors. So you see why a lost person who doesn't really have peace with God would want to be a missionary? Because they're trying to do everything they can to get closer to God. And so there's going to be a certain percentage of missionaries who are struggling in life and struggling in their spiritual life, struggling in their family life, because they're just this nagging sense of, I don't know God and I'm not right with God and I need to do more for God. And you'd say that wouldn't happen, but it does. It does happen. And so that's a freebie right there. I just want to make sure that when I'm talking to a missionary and you're counseling missionaries or you're going to the mission field, it has to be because it's the will of God, not to somehow pay the debt. It's not a work that you do. It's the fruit of the Spirit-filled life that God has so manifested itself in your life through the gospel. It's so powerful. It's the reconciliation to God has so changed you that you can't wait to tell other people about that. It's not that, hey, I owe God something, I got to go get this done. Missionary work doesn't bring salvation, and it doesn't bring sanctification. So I want to make sure missionaries, some of them come home having never really experienced Christ themselves. And you can see how frustrating that would be. And if you're here tonight and you say, well, I'm a Sunday school teacher. All right, are you a saved Sunday school teacher? So I'm a song leader. Are you a saved song leader? Or I'll say, I do youth ministry. Are you a saved youth leader? It's important. So that one tonight is free. And then I would say this, the second reason why missionaries come off the field is moral failure. We've been, I don't remember the dates, Cathy would remember the dates, but maybe a dozen years ago or 10 years ago, God really burdened us to help hurting missionary families. And I think the reason, the catalyst for that is because we were so broken when we came back. We were just tired. You ever just, you're done. Emotionally, physically, spiritually, and financially, we were at the bottom. And people started pouring into us. Not everyone. There was some criticism, but some people started pouring into us. And when they did that, the grace that they showed us during that time, we just feel indebted. So when we see other missionaries struggling, we thought, okay, if somebody reached in and loved us, we can reach in and love these people. And when we started doing that, I don't know the percentage. We've never done the numbers. But there is a vast, so a lot of missionaries. I don't know that it's the highest percentage, but it's at the top of the list of missionaries that come home because of moral failure. And I'll tell you some of the reason why that happened is because when the Lord sent missionaries out, he sent them out in pairs, twos by twos. And what we're doing is totally opposite to that. We're sending a family out. So if a husband and wife, Cathy and I say, well, there's two of you. No, we're one. We're bearing the same burdens. We have the same stress. We have the same issues within our children. If we have a ministry problem, we have the same ministry problem. We're bearing everything as one. And you can become very isolated on the mission field. And when you get isolated on the mission field, one of the things that people will do under those extreme times of stress is they will let their heart wander. They'll let their heart wander. So when we talk about moral failure, we're not just talking about adultery, we're talking about the mind first. Talking about the mind. So you say, what is pornography? It's adultery. It's adultery. How does that get started? Well, there's a lot of different ways, but if you take everybody from this church out of your life and you go sit in the darkest place of the world by yourself and see what happens to your mind, it's a difficult road. All right, so you're living here today in a land of light. There's churches, we passed churches after church after church just to get here. You're living in a land of light. There are Bibles on all the shelves. Even at the truck stops, the truckers are all reading Bibles. All the truck stops have Bibles. You come into a church, and man, it's amazing grace, and everybody is celebrating, and you worship together, and then you turn on the radio, and there's Christian radio stations everywhere. And do you ever struggle with your mind? Yes. I'll answer that for you so nobody has to answer it out loud. Yes. All right, now, let's remove you and put you in the darkest places of the world. No Christian radio, no Bibles on the shelves, no Christian fellowship, no amazing grace, no breakfast prayer meetings, you against the whole world, and the devil unleashes everything at you. That is not a good place to be. I'm not saying you have to live on a missionary compound with a missionary, but you better have a brother close by. Somebody who's fighting with you, somebody who's praying with you, somebody who is in the battle with you, because the idea of moral failure is not that we just sent a loser missionary who couldn't hack it. It's that in the darkest places of the world, when the devil comes against you and stress overwhelms you and things get difficult in your marriage, your mind begins to wander. Anything on that? Yeah.
I would just say with that, as far as on the women's side of that, again comes the tendency to protect our husbands. So even if a wife were to see something going on, she doesn't know who to turn to. Because if she turns to her pastor or a supporting pastor, they could have to maybe come off the field, and it just brings this whole, what are we going to do? And then even though it wasn't her fault, she caused that, or she started the ball rolling, and that changed their life. I think also on the field, and maybe I'm just speaking of myself here, I became very clingy because I had nobody else. And so I could see that that just brings another element of stress. And then I think ultimately, like everything else that we're going to talk about here today, is that when those missionaries are over there, the devil is not happy with them. And he's going to do whatever he can to destroy their family, to ruin their testimony, and to get them off of that field.
Yeah, so we've talked about we've talked about keeping our children safe this week. All right. There's no excuse for that, but that's not what I'm talking about here. I'm talking about good men under great stress who have problems. Well, I'm very gracious with those. I'm very gracious with missionary families who are struggling in this sense. It is common. And so when I preach out and when Cathy and I have an opportunity to talk like this, I just always extend that invitation to missionary families and to pastor families and saying, look, when you're struggling, when you're alone, when you need someone to talk to, reach out to us. I would not only extend that invitation to you tonight, but I would challenge you men to extend that invitation to others. So when you meet missionaries and things you can tell are starting to be a little chaotic in their lives, that you would extend them the grace that God has extended us by just saying simply, man, I understand some of those challenges. Let's talk about it. And so moral failure, what happens is it goes too far unchecked. There's no accountability system. Look at all the accountability we have in our lives. Man, I'm under constant accountability. My kids are following me around, playing with my phone. My wife is with me in the car all the time. Pastors call me all the time. I got to be in Sunday school. I want to be in church 5 nights a week. A lot of accountability. All that accountability disappears on the mission field. I leave my house 8 o'clock in the morning on the mission field. She doesn't know where I'm at until I come home. No one knows if I studied my Bible. Nobody knows if I went to Sunday school. So we're setting these guys up in a sense because we've removed all of that. So gracious accountability in the life of a missionary. And I would say that by working with a missionary team, even if it's an hour away, even if there's a missionary an hour away from you, set up 1 day a week where you get together and you keep each other accountable. So moral failures. The third thing I've got on my list here is missionaries return home from the mission field because of their sending church. A sending church should be the greatest asset to a missionary. Like, it's number one asset. Say, what's the biggest weapon in your arsenal? Man, I got a sending church. I got a church that if there's ever a crisis, or if things start to go wrong, or if I start to act funny, everybody knows, and they're going to come to my rescue. All right, so William Carey told his churches this. He grabbed 12 pastors, he brought them together, and he said, I'll go into the well if you hold the rope. Carey said this about India. He said, I didn't go to India to save India. I get into India to save England. Your church needs a missionary. You say, well, a missionary needs his church. No, your church doesn't exist without the emphasis of sending missionaries. This is why we live. So there's a symbiotic relationship between the missionary and the church. You need each other, and he cannot go without you. And so that takes a sacrifice financially. It takes a sacrifice emotionally. It takes a sacrifice spiritually. There should never be a week that the sending church doesn't somehow reach out, connect, pray with, pray for, contact that missionary. And here's what we have. Missionaries sent out of churches. Well, no, not sent, slipped out of churches. They slipped out. So what happened is either the missionary just was hard to work with and the pastor was glad to see him go, or the missionary had a zeal to go, but the church didn't match their zeal, so finally the pastor said, fine, go. And the missionary slips out, he gets to the mission field, and he essentially has no sending church. He doesn't have one. This is probably 75% of the missionaries I know have no sending church. It's a stamp on their paper, and that is all it is. Nobody is in the trench with them. Nobody's weeping, nobody's praying, nobody's fighting. And if I could fix one thing tonight in this, it would be a sending church holds the responsibility to get the missionary to the field and to keep them on the field and to sustain them. That is your responsibility. So stop blaming the missionaries every time somebody gets hurt. It's a sending church problem. It's a pastoral problem. Now, a pastor can't fix every bad missionary. That's not what I'm saying. But number one on top of number three. Should be letter A. Lay hands suddenly on no man. Don't send a man you can't trust. Recall 50% of our missionaries tonight. Bring them back in and say, guys, we got to talk this back through. Because if you're not doctrinally sound and morally sound, if you're not spirit-filled, if you don't know the scriptures, if you're not loving your family, you ought not to be there. So let's recall 50% of our missionaries, put them in a sending church that can help them get ready, and then send them. And when you send them, go with them in heart. Send everything. Put the resources behind. Put your money where your mouth is. We have a sending church problem. All right, so a lot of times a missionary comes home, everybody looks at the missionary and says, man, this guy didn't have what it takes. But if you pull back the curtain, you'll find a sending church that didn't give him the resources. And I'm not just talking financially. Everything from emotional encouragement to spiritual warfare, praying, to the training, to the teams coming to help. We have a sending church problem. Anything on that?
Years ago, we read a book called The Reentry Team to help missionaries coming off the field. And there was a part in the book that this church was talking about when their missionary was coming in. They put a picture of them up in the back, and they reminded their church people, listen, these are our missionaries. So when they come in next week, don't say, hi, thank you for visiting us today or whatever, because these are our missionaries, And I was like, that is so beautiful. That is so wonderful. So I was sharing that with someone, with the pastor, and the pastor said a good sending church wouldn't have to have put their picture up before they came home. They would have been referencing them the whole time they were gone. And I thought, 100%. And so I think, there's those two things, right? Absence makes the heart grow fonder, or out of sight, out of mind. And I think a lot of times when our missionaries leave, it tends to be more out of sight, out of mind.
And this is more than a pastor issue, it's a layman issue, because your pastor needs the layman to be the driving force behind this. If only the pastor prays and checks in on the missionary, that's a very weak church. So this is a layman-driven concept, okay? We are vouching for them, we're sending them. And when you do that and make that commitment, that's a major commitment. And if I was a missionary who was sent out of a church that I felt like even in the slightest way didn't have my back, I'd hold up, pull the reins, hold up, and say, Pastor, can we talk about this? Because I'm getting ready to put my life and my family on the line. Are you sure you've got my back? Do I need to look for someone else? Be careful who your sending church is. The fourth thing is culture. So we use the word expression culture shock, and a lot of us don't know what that is unless you've experienced culture shock. Culture shock can be described like this. You love people till you get to know them, and then you hate them. Right? So you love this idea of missions. Then you get there, 3 days later, your car's up on blocks, the tires are all gone. Right? You're sick. You got malaria. All right, everything you touch is dirty. You're drinking hand sanitizer. I mean, you're in this thing elbow deep, and you're like, what is wrong with these people? Do they not know how to shower? I mean, why do they steal everything I set down? And all of a sudden, the burden turns into great disappointment. It's not just the culture, it's the people themselves. And so, statistically, for most missionaries, this sets in 6 to 9 months. So your first 6 months on the mission field are just exciting. They're like, man, I seen monkeys, and the monkeys, stole my banana. That was kind of cute first time, And then all these kids running around in your car, and then kids inside your car, and then you start taking sick people to the hospital all the time, and then you go to a funeral, and then you go to another funeral, and then you're enveloped inside of this system, and you're like, what is wrong? And this happens not just going that direction. Do you know when they come here, they think we're crazy? When they come here, they're like, these guys are nuts. Every time you switch from one culture to the next, there's a breaking point. 6 to 9 months, statistically, your missionaries are going through some major changes. This can happen going west. I mean, you send a southern boy to the north, it'll break him. So, this is something that you have to look at with your missionaries and say, okay, is this missionary bad? Or is this just a normal symptom of being a missionary? Or are they just going through culture shock? So culture shock, a lot of missionaries don't make it through that first year. The first year can make or break a missionary. So how are they going to deal with culture shock? Number 5, missionary conflict on the field. Say, Brother Matt, don't all missionaries get along on the mission field? Well, let me ask you something. How many of you have a family? Doesn't your family get along all the time? All right, how about pastors in the area? Do they all get along? That's why tonight there's probably 25, 30 visiting pastors here. All pastors get along? No. All missionaries do not get along in the mission field, and according to ABWE in a recent survey, what they said is that the majority of missionaries leave the mission field for that reason, other missionaries. So Kathy and I, when we lived in Africa, we went to a birthday party for a little girl at one family's house, and then the other missionary families wouldn't talk to us, because we went to a birthday party at that missionary family's house. We're all independent Baptists. All of our doctrinal statements look the same. But there is so much interpersonal conflict inside the mission field that this is why you say, why do missionaries go alone? Because they can't get along with the other missionaries. Why don't missionaries have accountability? Because they can't get along with the other missionaries. This is a major issue. And this is actually what pushes our guys outside of our ranks. They find a Southern Baptist friend, a Free Will Baptist friend, they find a Pentecostal friend, and they'll actually fellowship and build accountability outside of our ranks because they can't get along with none of us because we're all too stubborn. Everyone has a pet doctrine. Everybody's got something. They're like, I know we agree on salvation, I know we agree on the church, but, open-toed sandals. That's wicked. Everybody's got their thing. And it literally binds these missionaries on the mission field to where they don't have anybody to fellowship with. So if you get to the mission field, you're going to have to find a family and say, look, let's drop the pretense. We don't agree on everything, but I need you. And take a humble position and just say, let's let our families love and fellowship with each other and to be able to come back and out from the battle and have a rest together. Missionary conflict has to be dealt with. We're trying our best to deal with that, but it's a major, major issue that we're dealing with. Anything on that? All right, so number 6 would be this, marriage problems. Now, I already talked about moral failure, moral problems. That's not what I'm talking about here. Moral failures might be a byproduct of marriage problems, but marriage problems is something completely different as far as everyone has marriage problems. I hate to break that news to you single people. Everyone has marriage trouble. So everyone has trouble with everything. I don't know if you've ever noticed that. You ever have trouble on the job? You ever have trouble at church? You have trouble with children? You have trouble at marriage? I think, does the Bible not say, as spark flies upwards, so man is born unto trouble? When we said I do, we invited a lot of trouble. I tell you, if there's one thing the devil hates, he hates our marriage. He hates us loving each other. Out of all of the pictures of Christ I see in the Scripture, the greatest expression of that is Ephesians chapter number 5. As Christ loved the church, right? So love your wives as Christ loved the church. If the devil can drive a wedge between us and I'm not demonstrating love and nobody can see that love, then it blinds people to the love of Christ, because it's one of the greatest expressions I have. So don't be shocked when a missionary has marriage problems. Don't be shocked by that. I wouldn't be shocked if the best pastor I know in the world has marriage problems. So let's define this. What happens in our marriage? What happens in our marriage? Brother Dave and I were just talking about this. Only by pride cometh contention. Only by pride cometh contention. Guess what happens? One of us, or both of us, won't practice humility. You say, well, where does that humility start? Well, Christ loved the church, gave himself for it, right? Husbands, love your wives as Christ loved the church. Who started the process of reconciliation? Who went looking for Adam in the garden? Who went to the cross? Why do you love him? Because he what? Because, all right, who started the process of reconciliation? I'm not giving you no blame ever. I'm just saying it's a man problem. It's my responsibility, I believe this, my responsibility to pursue reconciliation when things go wrong. So what did Christ do? Philippians chapter number 2, he humbled himself. So if I have swelled up with pride and I'm like, well, that woman needs to get right. It might, there's times maybe it was her. Very few times probably that it was her. But there might be something that she did. But you know what? Who starts reconciliation? Look, she could do it, but I'm going to go after her. You know why? I got one shot at this, guys. I love her. I've got one marriage, one wife, one life. I'm going to have a blast. We're going to make this thing happen. You see, yeah, but I know. Yeah, but you ever walk out on Christ? You ever do anything to hurt him? You ever disappoint him? You ever say something you ought not to have said to him? What did he do to you? Did he shut you off, close you off emotionally, or did he pursue you and reconcile you again? It's the ministry of reconciliation. There's this cycle where I'm not going to let the devil or something else ruin my home over my pride. I'm going to go back and just keep pursuing. Now, can one person make a marriage work? Not really. Not really. I can do my best, but she's going to have to humble herself too. She's going to have to forgive me when I hurt her. All right, so again, you guys know what I'm talking about, and you're living in a land of light. You're living in the land of amazing grace. You're living in a land where everybody at Walmart wearing a skirt, man. I mean, you're living in a land of Christians. Remove yourself and plant yourself in the darkest place and see what marriage problems come. The statistics will probably blow our mind, the amount of marriages on the mission field that are breaking apart. So when you talk to your missionaries and you say, how you doing? And they're like, brother, it's great. We had 3 saved last week, and it's been good. Sunday school was good. Okay, but how you really doing? How can I pray for you? How's your kids doing? How's your wife? You guys, how is life for real? See, we're good with the facade. We can paint a really good picture, and here's why, and this is part of the failure of where we're at in missions. Do you understand our livelihood is completely linked to how good we look? Not physically, because we'd be broke. But we're counting on the fact that when you look at us, you're like, man, their marriage is pretty good, and their kids are pretty good. Our livelihood is linked to that. So am I going to tell you, Brother Caleb, if I got a problem in my marriage? I ain't going to tell nobody. It'll cost me money. It'll cost me preaching opportunities. Anybody going to call me to preach if they know that we're struggling at home? They're not going to call me. So my calling and my livelihood are directly linked to how successful my marriage and my children are, so I have to cover it up. So unless you know your missionary well and love him sincerely, he will never tell you this. So 50% maybe of our missionaries are struggling, have those ups and downs in their marriage, and we'll never know. Because you don't love them enough to where they trust you to guard that information. So we have marriage problems in the mission field. If you're getting ready to go to the mission field, there's at least 3 or 4 couples in here that are praying that direction. You better start working on your marriage right now. Because I guarantee you those difficult days are coming.
I'm going to kind of step back, like before problems on the field, but before you go, before you publicly surrender, make sure you're on the same page. And since I'm not going to tell men what to do, I'm just going to share a testimony, if that's okay.
Don't preach.
I'm not. When Matt and I were engaged, I lived in Missouri, he lived in Iowa, and he called me and he said, Cathy, I surrendered to the mission field tonight. And he said, I don't know if the Lord will ever send me, but if he does, I'm going. And how do you feel about that? And I was honest with him, and I said, I have never felt like the Lord would use me in missions, but I know the Lord told me to marry you, and if you go, I'll go. And that sounds great, until he surrenders to Malawi. And he says, hey, what do you think? And I was the honest truth. He asked me every day for 3 months how I felt about Malawi, and every day I said, it makes me sick to think about it. I don't want to talk about it. And he didn't push me. And he didn't say, hey, lady, you said before we got married you'd go, so we're going. And I was so thankful for his patience with me and for him waiting for God to tell me instead of just Matt telling me. And when we got over to Malawi, we were there 10 days when my babies, literal babies, had malaria. And I knew, had I just gone with Matt because he said he was going, that I would have blamed him for my children being sick. Instead, I was like, okay, God has this. He sent us here, and there's a reason. And I just want to say I'm thankful for his patience with me, just letting the Lord speak to me in that time.
You know, you don't go to, if you're married, you do not go to the mission field by yourself. It's a joint effort. But Tim, I don't see how you can go unless you both see the need and the calling. I would not send a missionary whose wife sat there and said, I don't think this is a good idea. You can't do that. And that's not even on our list, except we just put it under this marriage. You have to be agreed. You have to be agreed. And men, sometimes you have to be patient. And I know a lot of ladies who feel like they should go do something and their husbands aren't hearing it. Well, you got to be patient too. And the same way. Don't be afraid. We taught this yesterday. It took Paul about 13 years to get into missions. Don't be afraid when God says, hold on, just stay here and work. Don't be afraid of that. I mean, that's a great thing. If God told me and my wife right now, hey, why don't you just buy a little house next to your local church, go in there and just help out, we'd throw a party. Whatever the Lord, it makes no difference to me. I mean, is the clay going to say to the thing that formed it, why have you formed me this way? A janitor or a missionary makes no difference to me. She'd choose the janitor. She'd be like, yes. So let God in his time put you on the same path so that you can fight together instead of fight each other. All right, marriage. Another reason why missionaries come home, and this happens to a lot of missionaries, is problems with children, especially as children get into the teenage years, 16, 17, 18 years old. This is a major problem because I'll let you tell you're green and yellow, blue, you're blue man. All right, so you're raising these children in this environment, and they lose their identity. So we've had kids come home from the mission field before. Families will come in, they come to our house, and our kids will be playing ping pong, and the missionary kids are like, what is that? Our kids are like, are you stupid? It's ping pong. But they are, yeah, it was Ben said that. No, our kids didn't say that, but they are an outcast in both worlds. They don't blend in Africa. They're not black. They don't speak the language properly. They didn't go to the public school. They can't still play football like the other kids. They don't fit there. They come home, and guess what? They don't fit here. They have a different vocabulary. They have a different sense of what things are worth as far as the way they spend their time. We've had kids come to our house that have never seen a movie, never seen a single movie. And I applaud that. But yet then when they sit down in a church with other kids, especially from a lot of churches, these kids look at them like they're strange, the strangest thing they've ever seen. So when they come home, they find that they're not welcome here. When they go over there, they're not welcome there. All right? So how are parents bridging the gap, and how are churches bridging the gap when you send these missionaries? How are you going to help bridge the gap for those kids to either stay in Africa or to return home? And there are some ministries been started the last few years specifically to missionary kids. One of them is called the Heirloom Project. So an heirloom seed, continually reproduces. And the point is this: our missionary kids ought to be primed for ministry. They already know it forward and backwards. They're bilingual. They know how to drive on the wrong side of the road. They should be the next generation of missionaries, but they're not. Because they're looking at the mission field as though that's what took me away from what I loved. It took me from my friends. It made my mom and dad go through these battles, constant battles. And so there's a huge ministry to be had to missionary kids.
You want me to tell that blue
Sure.
story?
You love to tell it, I know that.
Well, I read this illustration years ago, and I thought it was beautiful, and it tells the story of a blue man who lived in the land of blue with everything was blue, houses, cars, stores, games, food, everything was blue. And one day, God calls him to the land of yellow, and he's so excited to go and tell all of these people about Christ and all that he's done and give them the gospel. And he gets over to the yellow world, and he is so out of touch. He cannot fit in at all. And so he begins to learn the language, learn the culture, speak to the people, cook the foods they cook. And so one day he looks in the mirror and he's so excited because he's green. And so while he's not blue, he's closer to yellow, and he's so excited. And then the Lord asks him to go back to the States. So when he gets back here, or to their home, he gets back, and now he doesn't fit in here because he's no longer blue. And I just think that fits the life of a missionary exactly, because they go over, they don't fit in there, but then they need to come back, and then they don't quite fit in here either. And I would just say, this is separate from that thought, but encourage mamas to listen to their children in life, but on the mission field, on deputation. It's hard to go in a new church every week. It's hard to go in a church where people aren't like you on the field, or if they haven't learned the language yet, that's very hard to sit in a service and not have any friends. And when your children speak to you, their feelings are valid, and they may not even be correct. Maybe they're not thinking correctly, but that's still their feelings. And yes, we need to help them think correctly and see things correctly, but we need to make sure that we're listening to them and that we're encouraging them through those feelings all the way through the field. If we don't listen to them, they're going to find someone else who will, and then they may not be getting the godly counsel that they need.
All right, so number 8, poor character. There's been a big shift in character in the last 2 generations. Anytime you talk to somebody in their 70s or 80s, the first thing they're going to say is kids these days, and they got a point. My dad will be like, when I was 5 years old, I was driving a tractor, pulling wagons, My uncle was running the combine, and I was pulling wagons, at 5 years old, and he probably was. And then my generation, We had some hard days. We didn't have air conditioning. Can you believe that? We didn't have colored television. That's how old I am. Or poor. I don't know. I may not be that old. I might have been that poor. But we were raised a little bit different. And then now we're coming into a new generation. And this is not just a rant against young people, but there's a shift in character from Hudson Taylor to Jim Elliott to today. It's a big difference in character. And so we're sending a generation of missionaries to the mission field who have never had a job. Never. They went to Bible college, passed with C's, and we're giving them $10,000 a month to go to the mission field. And they have, listen to me, they've never had a job. Do you understand how insane that sounds? They don't know how to write a check. They've never done a budget, and we're throwing money at them. Do you think that they are so hyper spiritual that they will automatically pop up out of bed in Africa and go to work hard every day and be frugal with that money? No, they're not. It's not even their fault. I'm not even blaming them. I'm coming back to a local church issue, pastoral issue. So we have an issue with character. So we've got to deal with those issues in adolescence. Or we've got to deal with them if people get saved later. We've got to deal with them before we send them. And people got to be able, if I was sending a missionary today, you would not want to probably be sent out of my church. I would want to see your budget, and I want to see your family, how you're living. I want to see how's things working for you today. Because it's not like you're going to take a magic pill and wake up with character when you get there. That's not the way it works. In fact, the truth is this. Your character flaws are magnified now because you have no accountability. No accountability. More money than you've ever had, less accountability than you've ever had. Who knows when I go to work? But Tim, I may not have worked 2 days this year and you wouldn't know. Because all I got to do is embellish a letter and everybody think I'm doing pretty good. Now, I'm not saying everybody's doing that, but I'm saying you got to be careful. If you're a missionary going to the mission field, you better be self-starter. You better know how to get up in the morning and go to work and get work done. Now, let me say this. There are some guys who will just work themselves to death and neglect their family. That's just a wicked on the other side. If you're going to work hard, you better play hard too. So, but this is a real issue. Character issues are bringing missionaries home. All right, so I said character, and I also, because I didn't want to go to 17, I said also on the same line, carnal. The two go hand in hand. The two go hand in hand. You see a character flaw in David turns into a carnal flaw when kings go out to battle, but he didn't go, right? So character flaws turn into very carnal things. Money misspent ends up misspent on the wrong things. Time wasted ends up wasted on the wrong things. So be careful that you're not starting off on the wrong foot, going to the mission field without character in a carnal place. Number 9 is spiritual warfare. I hate even using the word because it has so many charismatic connotations to it. And I'm not talking about some weird, spooky feeling you got and somebody choked you, threw you down the stairs, and you got goosebumps. I'm talking about literally invading the devil's land. Like, think about this. For millennia, not decades, millennia, Satan has owned that village like a puppet master. And you're going to go and kick the door in and say, not today. Today, Jesus is going to reign in this place. Do you think that the enemy will be disturbed by your presence? He better be. He better be. If you're the real thing, he better be disturbed. Do you think that he has power to intervene in your life? You better think so. I first got to Africa, and I kind of thought the witch doctors were a joke, like they practice this trickery, like magicians' sleight of hand. I found out, Brother Tim, it's not sleight of hand. I found out that when someone says they're a witch doctor, that means they work for the devil. That means the devil's power is channeled through them as God's power is channeled through us, and it's the real thing. We had no idea. One of my first encounters with the witch doctor, I walked up to the witch doctor, had 4 pastors with me, African pastors. I walked up and I'm like, I'm going to get this witch doctor, you know. I mean, the gospel's got power. And I go up to him. I start talking to him. I confront him with the gospel. I turn around. All 4 preachers are gone. Not like they stepped back. They're gone. They're not even in the market. I was the only one stupid enough to walk up to the witch doctors. There's spiritual warfare. And then this is linked to this, is discouragement and depression. Those are spiritual things. Now, caveat to that, there are medical issues that affect sometimes the way you feel. I'm not saying that's not real. But I'm saying primarily on the mission field, a lot of what we're dealing with is there is a spiritual cloud that can hover over you. And when you talk to missionaries, and you can tell they're putting it on, they're faking their way through it, there is some deep spiritual war they're in, and it results in some really bad emotions. They feel things that are not true. You can wake up in the morning and think, man, my wife has never loved me. Why am I even here? Why am I going to stay with her? Now, you all know my wife a little bit. Is there anything that she's ever exhibited that would make you think that that's a true statement? No, but it's a true feeling. It's a true, I'm telling you, when the devil gets a hold of your mind, it's a true feeling. It's just as real as if it was real. There's no difference. And missionaries are under extreme warfare. It results in depression, anxiety, discouragement, and it's something you got to spot. I call it this, reading between the lines in a prayer letter. To be able to see that manifested and say, man, somebody needs to step in on this. This guy's bought into a lie. Something's going wrong here. And I would say that it happens to women more than men. So I think it's something that men need to be able to spot in their wives, and women need to be able to spot in their husbands. Pastors need to be able to spot in their missionaries. Laymen need to be able to spot when missionaries come through, because it is a real issue that we're dealing with.
I was just going to say, be the person that the missionary can call and talk to, and that you'll give them good godly counsel, and you're not going to blab it everywhere. I had a lady call me last year asking for counsel to share with someone, and I made the comment to her, well, everybody needs someone that they can call and talk to, that they can be truthful with and not feel judged and not be blabbed about. And she was quiet for a second, and then she said, I don't have that. And I thought, shame on me that I wasn't that person for her. I told her I would be now, but be the person that the missionary can talk to.
So this is another subject for another day, but coming out of that, if you've ever spiraled into depression, anxiety, discouragement, and it is grasped you, it's very hard to come out of that alone. I'm not saying that's impossible, but I'm saying that there should be a brotherhood among us where we can reach out to brother and say, man, I got to talk to you openly and honestly. Because again, all of this stuff is so closely linked. Moral failure and financial infidelity and all of this stuff these things are tied so closely together. One can initiate the next. Discouragement can initiate moral failure, or moral failure can initiate discouragement. And there's no way I'm getting through this life without somebody helping me through. That is impossible. I'm not getting through without somebody. So I've got to be able to call and cry on somebody's shoulder. And men don't like to do it, and you don't think you should do it, and churches don't like to hear about it. But if you're not doing it, if there's not somebody that you can cry to, you're going to end up in a dark place, a broken place. I would say this. For 40 years of my life, I lived my life, I would see somebody discouraged or depressed. I was like, dude, get right. What's wrong with you? And then I went through a time of, I would almost say depression. I don't know. I call it my midlife crisis. I don't know what it was. I was never diagnosed. But when I went through it, I'm like, oh, my word. I don't know that I'll live through it. I didn't know if our marriage would make it through it. I was just, and it didn't last very long, thank the Lord. But you go so low so fast, you're like, what has happened to me? And there was a couple people that I could reach out to and hear me through that. And she heard me through that. And if you don't have it, well, I'll tell you this, that's a lie, because you do have it. Somebody cares enough to hear you. Somebody cares enough. I know, because I care enough. So Kathy and I extend that invitation. And when you extend this invitation of grace to missionaries, they'll call you. They will call you. All right? So, I don't even know what that was. Spiritual warfare, discouragement, anxiety, depression. See how we had to get to 10? We just lumping them all together. All right, number 10. They don't know their Bibles. Missionaries quit because they got there and it was too hard theologically. The Catholics, the Seventh-day Adventists, the Muslims, they didn't know their Bibles. They got caught way off guard, got challenged on some of the hard subjects of the Bible, of Calvinism, King James Bible translation. They got challenged on things, and they folded. That's why we don't ordain novices. We ordain men who've already been in the fight. They've already went a few rounds and got their teeth knocked out, and they've been through some of that, and they got some conviction. So I am all for young men going to experience. I'm for young men going out and trying. But before you say, God has put his hand on me and this church is sending me to go into that dark place to establish church, I'm the man, make sure that you've got a good working knowledge of the Bible. Because it's amazing how many missionaries are out there, they're just grasping, trying to get the Bible figured out. I would say with that, too, see how we're going to have to cheat these, is they've never been discipled. They've never been under the wing of a man and watched that man deal with problems. They've never seen him deal with those questions. They've never seen him fight that fight. They've never stood alongside of that man. Be scripturally discipled. Not from the book necessarily, although there's nothing wrong with the book, but see a man go to war and see the way he does it. So make sure before you call yourself a missionary and go to the mission field that you're ready for the difficulties and challenges that are theological. Number 11, I tell you 16, and I tried. Number 11 is missionaries return home from the mission field because they're very poor communicators. Let's add one to that. They're poor administrators too. You might be the best worker this church has ever seen, but you might be the worst administrator this church has ever seen. Guess who administrates on the mission field? You do. Guess who has to write prayer letters? ChatGPT. Just saying, it can help. The idea that the success of your mission field will be with how well you communicate to your sending church, to your supporting churches, and to your men on the field. If you can't communicate, I'm not even talking about if you're a gifted preacher, like, man, you know when to raise and lower your voice, and you know when to pull. That's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about taking a truth and clarifying that truth to where the people just know what you said. Writing a letter to your churches to where those churches say, man, we caught the vision. We know what that guy's up to. There are some people that really struggle with communication, and you need to work this out. Now, I struggle with communication. Every time I preach, you're going to catch me say something crazy. Just because my brain and my mouth don't always get along. All right? They don't. I don't spell well. I don't do grammar very well. It's hard for me to tell a church my vision. It's hard for me to communicate. I have to practice that. I have to write it. She reads it, and she says, I think maybe you need to correct something. And then I send it to my son. He reads it, and he says, it sounds a little better like this. Then I send it to ChatGPT and say, fix this. It's hard. You have to become a student and learn to communicate, because a missionary who has poor communication is also going to have poor support. He's also going to have poor disciples on the mission field. So practice at communication. You don't know how to spell, learn to spell. You don't know grammar, learn grammar. Get somebody to help you. Take your vision statement and rewrite it 6 or 8 times until when everybody reads it, they know what it says. Learn to communicate, because poor communication skills, poor administration skills will send you home from the mission field. You won't make it. All right, number 12, and now I'm getting to the climax here, the best of the best. Number 12 is health. And if Chris was here, he would mock me. Chris and I have a unusual relationship. Mostly we mock each other. All right, so I'm not talking about living on kale and smoothies, but your body is the temple of the Holy Spirit of God. And the only way the gospel will be communicated is if you live long enough to get it where you're going, and if you're strong enough to get it there. And so if we came across missionaries who had no regard for their health, I would probably not support them. Amen. Now see, I need Brother Chris for that amen right there. I'm not talking about guys who drink an occasional Mountain Dew and eat McDonald's, because that would be me. I'm talking about somebody who has no regard for their health. They're going to be a poor investment. All right, if you were running a construction company, a guy came up, and you could tell this dude, he doesn't sleep right, eat right, he doesn't work out, he's never spent a day in the gym, he probably can't get that stack of 2x4s to that hill. You're not going to hire him. Why? He would be a bad investment. So, at this point, you say, Brother Matt, I'm not very healthy. I'm not talking about inherited disease. I'm not talking about crippling illnesses. I'm talking about the character to say, I better take better care of myself because I want to be a long-term investment for God and for the church, all right? And for the people on the mission field who need to hear the gospel, I have to live long enough to get the gospel to them, all right? Health is a primary concern. This starts in childhood. If all your children eat is chicken nuggets, chicken nug-nugs, whatever you want to call them, you better stop it. They better be able to recognize the importance of living healthy and long because they're the temple of the Holy Spirit of God. They're the ambassador of Christ. They have the ministry of reconciliation. They represent somebody. So we got to get this health thing straightened out. Now, that's not what I was talking about. That's for free. But what I'm talking about is the health crisis is faced on the mission field and in midlife and older life. We're coming home from the mission field because we are struggling with malaria and dengue fever. We're struggling with yellow fever, and we're struggling with things in Africa with their parasites. We're struggling with fibromyalgia. We're struggling with thyroid disease. We're struggling with things that not necessarily our own doing, but they are being heaped on us in the mission field, and we're struggling with those things. How do you show missionaries grace during those times? You have to understand that if they don't come apart for healing, they're finished. So you say, yeah, but we're going to have to pay them through that. So let me ask you a question. We send him a military man. We send him into Syria. He goes in. He trains for 6 months. He's deployed for 6 months. He comes back, and he has problems with his back because of the weight that he was under, because of the stress that he was under. He comes back, and he's not able to work. Do you pay him the rest of his life? Send him to his doctors, and with no complaints, we do that. 0 complaints. Nobody's out there picketing, stop paying for broken veterans. Dude, that dude would get hit by a car in 10 minutes. No one's picketing that. But when a missionary goes to the mission field, they come back with tropical diseases. C.T. Studd, they said this of C.T. Studd, they said he was a museum of tropical diseases. When we come back sick, everybody's like, how long are you going to support that guy? I don't know how long you want your teeth, right? Because I'm about to knock them out your head. How long are you going to support that guy? You sent him there. You sent him there with no regard for his life, and now he's come home broken, and you're the first one who wants to drop him. You think God is going to give you more missionaries? You think he's going to give you more missions money? You're the worst of the worst. No one would do that with their own child. No one would do it with the veteran. But you're so quick, I don't mean you. I mean you to the world, to the broad sense of guys who might accidentally be listening in. You're the worst of the worst because you kick a man when he's down. The man you sent and said that you'd have his back. And don't think they're not coming home sick, because they are. Everyone. The darkest places of the earth, the darkest continents, the places you would never go on vacation, that's where you're going to send them. And you'll be shocked when they come home sick. Why? What surprise? Why are we surprised? All right, so health needs. I'm not upset that missionaries get sick. We embrace that. I have videos of my kids throwing up on 6 continents, I mean, we embrace that. What disturbs me is the reaction of churches when missionaries get sick. Surprised by it. And I've had pastors who I'm good friends with who will probably watch this, who will ask those questions. Well, how long we got to support them? They've been home 3 months. Yeah. The pastors who get it right is the pastors who send their kids. They get it right. They get it right. Because they, in the back of their mind, say, well, if it's my son, I know what I'd do. Right? So they get it right. Number 107. Number 13, finances. We discovered this yesterday. Missionaries are undersupported. I know it's hard for us to reconcile because we live in the middle of nowhere. Our property taxes are low. Our houses are paid off or paid down. We drive 75 miles a week. Our cars don't get wore out. But that is not the life of a missionary. We're cutting edge. We're always on the road. We're always breaking something. We're always in the middle of whatever could go wrong. And our missionaries are undersupported by probably 50 to 75%. And so there's a financial strain upon them. I read this years ago, and this is well known, but I fought it for a long time, all right? So marriages end over finances. I said, that's not right. In my naivety, in our marriage as young people, there's only one thing married couples fight about. I'm not going to say it. Finances. And you say it's not finances. It is. Because the stress of constantly fighting to catch back up and her looking and saying, well, what are we going to do about this? I'm going to say, you're just going to have to trust me. And then I don't pay it. And she's like, you said I could trust you. I was like, I didn't mean it. We're undersupported. Now, that's our fault. Brother Giddens, that's not your fault. We're the ones who made the budget. I made the budget to torture my family. The church asked me what I need. I told them, and I didn't tell them enough. It's my fault. If I went in with a vision and said, look at this vision, this is going to be fantastic. All it's going to cost is $12,000 a month. We're going to go change the whole world. I can change. I can take care of my family. Churches would buy it. But I go in and say, I'm the cheapest investment you've ever made. Anybody buy stuff off of like Temu or all this Wish? Anybody buying this stuff, You buy that and you buy that stuff and you think this is going to be the best, then you get it and it's the worst thing you ever bought in your life. You got a deal on it, but you got what you paid for. Can I tell you something? You can't oversupport a good missionary because they will print tracts and they will order Bibles and they will put out street preachers and they will help national pastors get set up and you cannot oversupport them. Why? Because their budget's their budget. You can't change it. My budget doesn't inflate. Okay, well, if we pay him more, he's just going to make more money. No, I don't. My budget is the budget. It is what it is. And you can't underpay it either because it won't work. So we send them undersupported, and then we complain when they come home. But I will tell you this, it's their fault. We need to be talking about the right numbers, and we need to be honest with what it cost us. As when he did those numbers on the board yesterday, it makes my stomach sick because I hate to ask a church for that much money. But I also know my boys make that cutting grass. Guys at our town, we live in a little town, 1,700 people. That's how much they make building cabinets. So I'm embarrassed to ask for as much money as the 20-year-olds in our church are making. And we've been at this 25 years. So I have to flip a switch. A missionary's got to flip the switch and say, okay, why are we putting our families under this incredible amount of stress when I could just get honest with myself and say, my wife needs some things. And God ordained, I didn't make this up, God ordained that the churches pay for that. I'm telling you, I did not make it up. You think the Levites walked around the Old Testament apologizing to every Jew they met? Guys, I'm sorry. I'm sorry. That whole tithe thing and all of those, I'm sorry. God didn't know what he was doing when he did that. I ate you guys' crops. Ah, man, do you think for a moment that ever crossed a Jew or a Levite's mind? God said what to do. God ordained they that preach the gospel, live of the gospel. You don't muzzle the ox that treads out the corn. Does any man go to warfare at his own charge? So, this is my confession. I put my wife under a ton of stress for 25 years because I didn't do the budget and go to the churches and say, here's what it's going to cost. That's my fault. So if you are 25 years old and you take 2 years of your life to get your budget right and get your funds raised, you will be 27 years old. You're going to do missions till you're 67. For 40 years, your family just gets to love missions. But if you do that budget wrong and you get it wrong, you're going to have 40 years trying to get this thing figured out. You'll be flipping flapjacks, trying to sell them on the street, making funnel cakes. We had done everything. Auctions and eBays and car washes, and and if I had it to do again, I would settle in for 2 years and just say, I'm going to get this thing right. Because our missionaries are returning home because they don't have the money. That's their fault. Now, maybe somebody didn't counsel them, didn't tell them, maybe their pastors didn't help them, but they could have fixed that one right there. No comments? I'm sorry for making you live poor for so long. All right, so that's 13 with some add-ons, some extras in there. There's enough missionary families in here tonight. Maybe some of these things you're thinking, okay, I've already experienced that, or maybe at least you're thinking, I better prepare for that. Or maybe you're thinking, there's somebody who's been through this, and I can talk to them about that. So this is not uncommon. This is just normal. This is, when you embrace missions, this is what you embrace, these kind of problems. You'll never eradicate them, but you can mitigate them. You understand the difference? Mitigation means, I know how to deal with that. The emergency fund that we talked about yesterday is so important. You know why? I constantly have emergencies. I don't think we have hardly a week without some emergency. Somebody will get up and take an offering. You know what I mean? Always living in an emergency. So we mitigate these things. What do you do about the health issues? Well, you try to eat better, you try to sleep better, and then you have money. Money mitigates problems. I didn't make that up. That's just the way it works. I could go into some Bible on that, but money mitigates some of those problems. All right, but here's what I do want to do. I want to give you an opportunity to respond to the Lord tonight. If you're on the side of this saying, Brother Matt, I'm experiencing and living through this, I'm preparing for this, my heart, I just need to pour my heart out to the Lord. Or maybe you're saying, I have not done my part to minister to the missionaries who are in this. However the Lord has spoken to you tonight, let's do this. Let's have a word of prayer.